So it's February 29th. I am very blessed to be here with Bill Paisley, and it's going to be exciting. Call sign Pinch. So, Bill, when and where were you born?
I was born in the August of 1958 in Opelika, Alabama. That's a little town that's right down next to Auburn, where Auburn University is. And Auburn was our family school. That's where my grandfather went, my uncle went, my dad went, and I was headed there at one point to graduate school. And about that time, the Navy called up, or at least that's when I was accepted by the Navy. But Opelika, Alabama, so I'm a Southern boy.
So, growing up in Alabama, what was your childhood like for you? Is this a small town? Is this near a big city? What was it like?
Well, it was small, obviously. Opelika, that area, Opelika and Auburn is down in the southeastern part of the state, and I was only there for maybe a year, so I don't remember much really about Opelika. After that, my dad he was flying for Braniff Airways at that time, so we moved to Texas and spent a couple of years there. He was flying for for uh, for Braniff Airways with flying DC-9s and some of those old tail draggers and stuff like that. And then he made the decision that he wanted to get back into the Navy. He was in the Navy for about 3 or 4 years in the mid 50s. He got out, was an airline pilot, didn't like that. So he got back into the Navy there about 1960 or 61. So again, kind of doing the track here. Born in Alabama, spent about a year there, went to Texas around Amarillo, and from there went down to Meridian, Mississippi. And that was where my dad's Navy career restarted. So the earliest memories that I have of things was probably there in Meridian, which was a brand new Navy base down there that they had built. It was a training base where they would train pilots. And it was named, interestingly, John McCain, who ran for president. When was it? Back in 2008 or something like that.
Yes, sir.
His grandfather was a Navy admiral, and that base is named for him, McCain Field.
Wow, that's really impressive in itself. Just the history with that too, the legacy.
Yep.
Now, growing up, through your childhood into your teenage years, I mean, we're talking about Vietnam is still taking place and the withdrawal from Vietnam. Do you remember any of that?
Oh yeah, sure. My dad had two combat tours going to Vietnam. He was an A4 pilot. He flew
Wow.
Skyhawks, and so he went in 1960, basically 65 to 67 was his time that he spent on two aircraft carriers, on the USS Ticonderoga first, and then the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear powered carrier. And so he had 250 combat missions, which is a lot.
No kidding.
Air Force pilots were finished with their tour when they hit 100. But Navy, you just keep flying until you're done. And so he had 250 missions. So I remember that very, very. And plus, we were in a Navy town. It was Lemoore, California, when we lived in California first. And so we were surrounded. All of my friends were Navy kids, and most of their dads were pilots, just like my dad. So I remember that. We were in the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts at that time, and I can remember the flag and how important that was inculcated into us, how important that flag was and what it meant to us. So yeah, it was very important, all those mid 60 to late 60 Vietnam years.
Well, the fact that your dad has two tours flying A4s off of Yankee Station, I assume, in that
Yankee
area.
and Dixie.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, A4 is a nimble aircraft, but to my knowledge and research, it was used a lot for close air support and to, at least from the Navy perspective, draw out SAM sites early on in the war, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, that was one of his missions. It was called the Iron Hand mission, where you carried Shrike missiles, which were anti-radiation and anti-radar missiles, and you would fly into the envelope of a radar station, and as soon as the radar got on you, the Shrike missile would be able to lock on that radar, and so you would shoot it. But a lot of times, most times, those radars that you were shooting at were also tied into the SAM missiles. So if you were shooting a missile down towards the station, if you were shooting your Shrike missile down there, a lot of times there was a SAM coming back up at you. So that was a really, and my dad was one of the squadron guys. He was a lieutenant commander in the squadron, so that was a fairly high rank. And with rank goes responsibility, as they say. And so he did carry a lot of those heavier missions quite often.
Well, if I may ask, do you recall what squadrons your dad was with on his deployments?
Sure. It was one squadron. It was VA-56. It's not a squad. They decommissioned it, I think, sometime in the late 80s or something like that. But it was a single seat A4 squadron. He did one cruise on Ticonderoga on the carrier, which was interesting. That was a World War II carrier. So it was a fairly small deck. And they came back. They had about an 8-month turnaround, and then they went back to Vietnam. But this time they were assigned to the USS Enterprise, which was the first of the super nuclear carriers. So going from a small World War II carrier with wooden flight decks made out of wood, onto the Enterprise, that was the biggest ship in the world at that time, was just incredible to him, especially to the really small Skyhawk.
Absolutely. I mean, I can just only imagine too having to share that deck with F4s. You've got to share that with Crusaders, if I'm not mistaken, and just the fact that flying combat missions, planes are coming back with holes in them from flak and anti-aircraft fire. And so, did your dad ever tell you any of those stories of combat flying? Being eventually you yourself went into naval aviation.
Well, he did, but it was mostly after I got in, and we were talking quite a lot about it. He One interesting thing about his flying experience, he never got hit. There was never a bullet, an anti-aircraft bullet or anything ever hit his airplane over 250 missions, which was incredible. He did have some really close calls that he told me about. And I got a friend here that wants to get up in my lap. So
that's all fine, Bill.
This is Cece.
Hi, so, CC.
Yeah, she'll sit here in my lap and be very happy. But he did tell me some very close calls that he had. He had things like they would fly. The weather in North Vietnam was really bad sometimes, and they'd go flying, and they wouldn't be able to drop their bombs because of the overcast. Well, every once in a while, they would find a break in that overcast, and this flight of 3 or 4 A4s would come in, and as they would come in, they would bank down and go through that break in the clouds to get down below it to go do their mission. And he was telling me this one time that he was number 3 out of 4 airplanes, and the first guy went through, and that woke up everybody down on the ground with the anti-aircraft weapons. The second guy went through. They knew where it was coming, so they started shooting then. And when my dad went through, that's when they were starting to zero in on the next plane coming through. And he said he put about 10 Gs on that A4 to get out of the way of those anti-aircraft fire. So things like that he would share with me sometimes. But I always wanted, even especially after I started flying, I said, you got to write a lot of this stuff down, Dad. And he just never got around to it.
And I mean, it's incredible because I mean, I don't know how much research you've done into your dad's squadron, but if I'm not mistaken, their original skipper in '67 was listed as MIA until the '90s.
Yep, I can tell you who that is. That was Pete Sherman.
Wow.
And there's a story behind that is very important to this discussion, I guess. My dad left. I've got a picture of Pete Sherman. He was the XO to the commanding officer, whose name was C. Ray Smith, on the second half of the Ticonderoga deployment. And then there was a change of command. Pete Sherman took over, and they left on the Enterprise. And I've got a picture of Pete coming out to shake my dad's hand, or my dad's hand, after his last flight. He had orders to come home in about a day or two, and I can send that to you. That's kind of interesting. And so Dad left the squadron. It was still online in North Vietnam. Pete Sherman was shot down about a couple of weeks after Dad left on one of those Iron Hand Shrike missile anti-aircraft radar missions. And my dad has always said, if he was still there, that would have been his mission, and he would have survived it because he was so experienced with it.
Wow. I mean,
And Commander Sherman's wife, Betts, they had, I think, 4 or 5 kids, and they were not neighbors of us, but we were very close. After my dad got back from Vietnam, his next tour of duty was at the Naval Postgraduate School there in Monterey. So we spent 2 years in Monterey while he went to that school. I was about 10 years old then, but Betts Sherman, who was Pete Sherman's wife, and their kids lived in Monterey down by Pacific Grove, I think. So we visited them, and we were good friends with them an awful lot. An interesting side note of that, when I got married in 1986 or 85, my wife's parents were squadron, not our squadron, but he was an A4 pilot, and so it was one great big family thing that we did. And I went over to Carrie's house once with her, and this lady came out and said, "You have got to be a Paisley." And it was Betts Sherman who had come to visit. And yes, for where they did that, and I never understand how, but they did dig up his crash site where his plane crashed, and he was identified, and they did get him on the repatriation list.
wow. I mean,
yep.
It's an incredibly small world to think about how growing up, you grew up right alongside the Sherman family. And even after that, too, the recognition there. And that's one of the things I love about the naval community is how small it is, aviation wise, and how well connected it is.
Oh, it is. I would see people from my tours of duty and whatnot. I would see them 15 years later because I was still with the reserves, and I spent about 2 months in Qatar. And I met 2 or 3 guys from my active duty time in the late 80s and early 90s. You just run into people all the time.
Now, as you grow up and get into your high school years, what are you thinking high school wise of what your goal is? Go to college, into the Navy, go have a career. What was your mindset?
Yeah, let me highlight that there for a minute. When I was growing up and my dad was going to Vietnam and all that stuff, we were very active because Dad was one of the senior guys. He was number 3 in the squadron. There was a CO and the XO, and then there was generally the operations officer or the maintenance officer, or those were the senior guys. And Dad was basically number 3. His jet with his name on it on that last cruise, it was jet number 403. 400 usually belongs to the CAG. 401 belongs to the CO. 402 belongs to the XO, and 403 was my dad's plane. And so I grew up with these guys, and I knew a lot of them. And I was only 6 or 7 years old then, but I still remember quite a few of them. And these guys were my heroes. They were they were godlike. They were just supermen. And when I grew up, and it was a kind of unique little time that I had. My dad's last duty station that he took was in England. So we spent 3 years there. That's where I went to high school on one of the DOD schools in London Central High School, which was right outside of London. So I was, again, up until then, I had absolutely zero ideas about joining the Navy. Because, again, you got to think, these guys that I worshiped when I was younger, and I could never be like that. You just can't do that. You can't be like your heroes. You just can't think about that. And it doesn't mean that didn't interest me. My brother Bob wanted to do that. He wanted to go to the Naval Academy. He wanted to fly. He wanted to do all that stuff. So he started going to a military academy for high school, which was Frederick Military Academy. It was in Portsmouth, Virginia. And I was number 2 son. Bob was first. He was about a year and a half older than me, and I was number 2. So I was going through hero worship with Bob, with my older brother. So I ended up going to Frederick, not again because I wanted some kind of military career. I was just doing what Bob did. So I went for a year to Frederick Military Academy, loved the military aspect of it. And then we moved to England. This was 1974. And so I spent 3 years there and had a great time, great school, great experience, got to see a lot of Europe, really fortunate. And again, still didn't even think about the military. I wasn't going that way. What that did do, though, is that I enjoyed that experience so much. I thought, I'd kind of like to teach high school overseas in this overseas DoD system. So my dad retired in 77. We moved to Nova Scotia. That's where my grandparents were from, and that was where the retirement place was for my parents. So that's where I ended up when I was 18 years old, up in Nova Scotia, the eastern part of Canada. And I started going to college. I was going to get I did get 2 teaching degrees, and I was still in touch with the with one of the counselors from my high school in England, and he gave me all the information what I had to do if I wanted to teach overseas. And so I got my degrees, and my dad just out of the blue said, the Navy needs teachers. There's education programs and there's reasons to teach. Why don't you talk to them? So I just got to thinking, okay, I was in the job hunting mode at that point. Now, again, you got to think this is the early 1980s. It was the start of the Reagan years and the Reagan military buildup. So the Navy was really looking for aviators, for aircrew, for things like that. My parents were in the process of moving from Nova Scotia back down to Alabama with my grandmother. And so on a visit to them down there, I stopped by a Navy recruiter down there in Montgomery, Alabama, just to talk to him. They told me about the Aviation Officer Candidate Program, and I thought, well, it's going to be tough. I mean, I went to a Canadian college, and I lived in Canada for 7 years. That's got to be a problem, right? And they said, nope. The same company that accredits American colleges accredits Canadian colleges. So as long as you got a degree, you're good to go. So I thought, okay, well, I've been wearing glasses my entire life. Well, that's not a problem. You could be a Naval Flight Officer. You can still fly. So everything kind of came together at that point in 1983, 1984, and I made the application, and I was turned down the first time when I graduated from college with my second degree in 83, but I reapplied, and I can still remember, it's like Marshall McLuhan saying that you always remember the important things in your life. The phone call that I got from my recruiter, who was out of Portland, Maine, he called up and said, Bill, you're going to Pensacola. So I got accepted, and this was the summer of 84. And my class started probably early October or mid-October of 84. That's when I formally got in the Navy and started Officer Candidate School.
Well, first of all, that's an incredible story of the bouncing around England, wanting to be a teacher. As a teacher, I relate to that. Sometimes I question why I went into this profession. Clearly, it was not for the money, but it's always what I wanted to do, though. I mean, I love teaching history, but a second passion for mine has always been looking to the sky. I love aviation, and I can share that. When I was in England for a summer, I spent part of my time, or in Europe, I should say, I spent part of my time in England studying the Battle of Britain, especially some of those fighter command bases down south of London along the coast in an area called Hell's Corner. And I found it fascinating, the aerial dogfights of the Battle of Britain in that summer of 1940. And so that sparked a huge interest, but then factored in too that how everything lines up for you, and it's just circumstance. You're now in Naval Aviation Officer Candidate School. How did you find that? Was it challenging?
Well, yeah, pretty much so. One of the things that hit me at one of the occasional tough and difficult times, I would say to myself, hundreds or thousands of people have come through this before, no different than me, and I'm no different from them. So I can make it through. You just got to and that was the start of a very good. I had learned a lot in college about critical thinking skills and about that kind of way to approach any kind of problem. So I started to draw on that kind of stuff, and once you get it in your head that you do what these were Marine drill. It's totally different now. We had Marine drill instructors who were teaching us. Now it's Navy chiefs that teach the aviation. They closed down Pensacola. They moved everything up to Newport, Rhode Island, where where the regular officer candidate school is. And most of us that went through the aviation program in down in Pensacola really think it's a much less of a disciplined and a very good place. So with that, what's kind of interesting is my dad went through the old NAVCAD program, which stands for Naval Cadet Program, which was in the 50s. Actually, they did bring it back in the late 60s, but I've got pictures of him in his NAVCAD uniform and me in my AOCS uniform, exact same program, exact same uniform. You would have thought we were in the same class, and we were separated. Well, he was 50, 54, 64, 74, 84, 30 years. So kind of cool.
Well, it is cool too. And I'm curious, Pensacola, I mean, you know, we're talking Gulf Coast, beautiful beaches, beautiful coastline. Also, at the same time, I know Pensacola has been referred to as the frying pan because it's hot as hell.
It can be. Wintertime can also be cold as hell. We did winter. I was commissioned February 22nd of 85. So you do your water survival program at the end of the program. So we had to go jump into Pensacola Bay in late January, early February, and that water was pretty damn cold. We would get hoisted up on a helicopter, and as soon as we would get up to the door, the guy would say, "Open your mouth," and he would pop in a little lozenge or something like that so that we could suck on it, and then they would drop us back in the water. There was a boat that would come and pick us up, and they had a whole one of those big silver urns of chicken noodle soup they would give us because it was so cold, and they would give us a little cup of this hot chicken noodle soup, and we just sit there shaking, sipping it and stuff like that. So that was kind of cool. We did everything during that water survival. We did that parasailing. I mean, tourists pay for that kind of crap down in the Bahamas and stuff. We got paid to do it. They would tow us up. We'd go about 500 feet or whatever it was. There were these two little handles called pelican hooks that if you hit them, then it disconnected you from the tow rope. So they would pull us up and we'd hit those pelican hooks and we'd sit there and drift down 500 feet or whatever and then go through the whole water stuff. The acronym was IROC. You inflate your life vest first. You R stands for I'll remember here in a second. It's been 30 plus years. IROC and the latter IROK. K is the coke fittings, which is what your parachute attached to on your torso harness. So you go through that whole thing, and again, you're sitting in the water and you back paddle away from all the parachute cords, so you don't get wrapped up in that and stuff. So, and then the boat would come along again and pick you up and give you your little cup of so the water survival was really cool, but it was really cold. But overall, Pensacola was very, very neat. In fact, I hate to do all these little tangents, but after we got back from England, so I was 18 years old now. My grandparents lived down near there. So we went down there. We hadn't seen them the 3 years we were in England. These were my dad's parents. So we drove down there to Perdido down in lower Alabama. And I rode with Dad when he went over to the base to go get something because he was retired and all that stuff. I was 18, so my dependent ID card was expired. So I had to sit in the car while he went in the exchange for the first time. And I can distinctly remember thinking to myself, well, if I want to go back into the exchange, I'm just going to have to join the Navy. So that was just another one of those little funny things that happened. And lo and behold, about when was that? That was 77, 78. So about 6 years later, I did join the Navy, and I did get to go in the exchange. So,
Well, I mean, and with that too, I didn't anticipate this, but what can you find in the naval exchange?
oh, it's a Walmart. It's really, you can actually get better deals now at Walmart or at good grocery stores or things like that than the commissary. But used to be for the longest time. I don't know if it was tax free, but it was lower prices. Seriously, in in the commissary and the exchange, but it's just like a big Walmart. There's really nothing different. And the Navy, they had to pull their head out of their backside a couple of times. They had a contract with Citgo Oil for a long time. Citgo was owned by Venezuela, by the government of Venezuela. And so whenever you bought gas from Citgo on a Navy base, money was going right into the pockets of whatever the hell that guy's name was. He's been dead for so long now. Whoever that communist dictator in Venezuela was, it was going to him. And now the Navy does not have those contracts with Citgo anymore. But for the longest time, it was that was where you bought gas on base at a Citgo, and the money was going to Venezuela. So I'm glad they don't that.
I know for a fact that now, at least, the Blue Angels are stationed at Pensacola. When you were going
Yep.
through your initial training, were they still there?
Oh yeah. In
So
fact, well,
take it away.
real quick, my 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 wife Carrie, she's not my wife now. We got divorced about 10 years after we got married, but she was they lived down there in Pensacola. Carrie's got an older sister, Christy. She was dating Pat Walsh, and Pat Walsh ended up being the deputy CNO at the end of his Navy career, and he was the number 4 pilot, the slot pilot for the Blue Angels for their last A4 year and for their first F-18 year. So my girlfriend's sister was dating a Blue Angel, and here I was, little Mr. Boot Ensign, brand new ensign, but Pat was cool enough. He invited me out to the Blue Angels hangar when on that winter time, we were down there to spend Christmas with Carrie's mom. And he took me out to the hangar. So I got to see the new F-18 Blue Angels before they even flew. He took me in the hangar, took me up to the ready room. I met 2 or 3 other of the guys who were working. They weren't flying then, or if they were getting ready to go out to California for their winter training and stuff like that. But yeah, the Blue Angels were there, and I got to hang out with them a little bit, and it was very cool.
That had to be one of the coolest experiences ever. I know before Pensacola was closed due to the unfortunate incident that happened a few years ago with the shooting.
Yep.
I was able to get on base in 2017 and see a Blue Angels training exercise, and that was one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. Is watching the formations as you've seen it. You flew as a RIO yourself. You know what it's like. I mean, my God, the experience and the crowd, wicked.
That's one of the cool things about being down there. You get a free air show every week because they would go through their little training and flight maintenance program and whatnot. So you would see them all the time, and and plus, if you knew where to go on the base, you could get great views there too. So it was always cool.
And with that, going through your initial officer training, did you find that your skills as an educator also aligned with what the Navy was looking for as well? Did anything that you had learned about being a teacher apply to what were you doing there with the Navy?
Well, again, like I mentioned earlier, as I was hitting some of those tough spots, and I just mean like academically, I was always good with the non-technical things. And I had to learn about engines, and I had to learn about aerodynamics and things like that. And those were a bit of a challenge. I've got another story I can tell you about how I made it through one of the very difficult F-14 RIO sort kind of training programs. But that critical thinking skill, that thing where you really need to sit down and think about, break things into different little sections and figure out how to handle each one of those. And it doesn't matter. I mean, basically, if you just did everything to the best of your ability, and officer candidate school, aviation officer candidate school was all being able to function under stress. So these Marine drill instructors would put you in an awful lot of stress. Yelling at you, getting in your face. They had their little Smokey the Bear hat, and they'd sit there and pop it, and it would hit you in the forehead while you're trying to recount the 12 general orders of a century, which you have to memorize. The first general order is take charge of this government space and all government places in view, or something like that. And while he's yelling at you, and while they're tearing your room apart, and when he's popping you in the forehead with this thing, you got to say, so if you can function or learn how to function under stress, that is the best part to get through that. Because they always say, if you did something wrong, they'll come up to you and right in your ear, you just crashed, boy. You didn't pay attention to detail. Attention to detail. That was the driving factor. That phrase, attention to detail. And I can remember later on in my flying career, making sure that you pull the pins on those ejection seats, that you make sure that the missiles that you carry have their safety pins taken out, that the Sidewinder missile with the infrared seeker head on it has got a cover on it so it doesn't sit there and burn out because of the sun or something like that. But that's taken. So attention to all these little details to make sure that you can go flying in a safe manner was very important. So once I got that in my head, that yeah, you need to pay attention to detail, and I'm sure that the Naval Academy guys probably had a certain amount of that drilled into them every year for their 4 years at the Naval Academy. I came from Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and so I certainly had critical thinking skills taught, but not attention to detail. So that was very important. That was a very important thing that they got to me there at that point. So yes, there was a lot of the teaching stuff that I carried over in many ways that did help me out.
Well, I mean, and I find it incredible too. I mean, simply put, the training, the stress, I mean, it's very similar to other veterans I've interviewed, but I always find it immaculate and brilliant how you make it through it, because a lot of it's up here. It's a mental game. Now, during this training, were they putting you into prop planes just yet to get that flying experience, being that you're in Pensacola?
No. Eventually we did. During the 14 weeks of Aviation Officer Candidate School, and I started in October and I finished in February, and I was lucky because we had a week's break at Thanksgiving, so I got to get out of there and go home for Thanksgiving for a week, and then I got 2 weeks at Christmas. I got to go home and get away from that. And the interesting thing about that Christmas break, two of the biggest toughs, the aerodynamics test for the aerodynamics course and the mile swim all happened. Well, the mile swim happened just before the 2 weeks of the Christmas break. The aerodynamics test happened right after we got back. So you had 2 weeks to absolutely study your ass off about all that aerodynamic stuff. And I passed it without a problem. Plus, I did get the mile swim. We had one guy, Mike McCormick, who was a water polo player for I think it was USC, for the University of Southern California. He was in our class. He gets in for the mile swim. He climbs out after 24 minutes. And I'm in there for an hour and 10 minutes or something like that, just flopping around trying to get, you can't touch the bottom at all for that mile swim. And you got 15 other guys in the pool with you. So it's just, it's assholes and elbows and everything. You in the face, really kind of fun. And I forgot what the question was.
Well, with that, first of all, I was going to ask that mile swim test. That sounds terrible. I mean, that sounds like an absolute nightmare to be treading water and to swim for a total mile.
Well, if you're treading water there, then you're not doing it right, because you got to swim around the pool. You got to keep swimming. and it just takes forever. And there's some, and it was like 25 laps or something like that, or 28 or 30. And there are guys that are there are guys on the side of the pool, some of the trainers and the instructors, they get 5 guys and they keep track of them. And they'll tell you as you're coming by, that's lap number 15. So it's a little bit of a motivator for you. But we used to say if that mile swim was a recurring qualification that you had to do, I'd be driving a truck, because doing it once was enough. That was it. We had to go through water training, survival training, every 3 or 4 years or something like that, which I understand. But you only had to do the mile swim once. And getting back to your yeah, once was enough. And getting back to the flying part of it, during OCS there during that entire 14 weeks, of course, there's no flying. They're not going to give you any good deals like that. That's not part of the staying cool under stress kind of thing. Then we had about a 3 or 4 month break until our class in VT-10 started out. And VT-10 was the first Naval Flight Officer NFO training program. And you go through ground school there, where you learn about the T-34 at that time, which is the training thing, and all that. And after about 2 or 3 months of that, going through ground school, then you do start your T-34 program. So then you do get to climb into this little teeny weeny prop that it was actually very fun to fly and all that stuff. And after about, I don't know, 10 or 15 of those flights, they do stick you in a jet. They do put you in a T2. I mean, this is the way it was 30 years ago. I'm sure it's all different now, if not just because all the planes are different. But they would put you in a T2 so that you could fly around in a jet, because that was about the time that you made the aircraft selection program. Do you want to be a jet guy or a prop guy or a helo guy or whatever? There weren't too many NFOs that went helo, I don't think. I think those are all pilots. But it was either the P3 or one of the other jet prop things, or a jet program, the F-14 and the A6. And that's when you make up your mind after that first jet hop that you got. I like jets. That's cool. I want to go jet. Or if you got sick all the time, I can't handle this, I'm going to have to go P3s. So that's how you ended up doing the jet selection. I loved it. It was my first jet flight. I have flown with my dad in little T-30 or in little Cessnas a little bit before, so I had been flying in a small plane, but I never had any problems with anything. I loved the jet flight. I loved the T2, so there was no question what I was going to request.
Well, with that, I mean,
oh,
I was gonna even ask, and by the way, the tangents are great. Never apologize for the side stories. This is awesome.
Okay,
but
there's a lot of them.
That's okay. That's what I'm here for. And
yeah,
but when you are going through this program, eventually the flight training and then eventually getting into the aircraft ground school, had you seen an F-14 up until that point?
Yep. I interestingly enough, the F-14 basically hit the fleet in, I think, 74 or 75. It first flew in 70, then it took a couple years to get through the entire Navy acceptance program, and then it hit the West Coast first because Enterprise took VF-1 and VF-2 on one, on a Vietnam deployment, and they did fly over Vietnam, South Vietnam, a bit during the last couple of years. It hit the East Coast where we were probably a couple years later, 74, 75. When we were in England, VF-143 sent a couple of planes up to an air show in England that my dad's duty at that time, he was working with an organization that's moved from England down to Naples now, Sincus Navier, which is Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Navy Forces of Europe. Okay, it was in England at that point. Here's another little aside history thing, because we were so concerned at that time frame about the Soviets and that area called the GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, that area that the Northern Fleet of the Soviets was going to come through and attack us. We wanted to make sure that we owned that space. So Cincus Navier, the European Navy Command, was based in London at that time. And my dad was air operations with that. So he was actually the one that suggested that VF-143, and I can't remember what carrier they were off then, I'd have to look it up, but fly from the carrier down in the Med up to this air show up in England. So when I was in high school, probably 76 or so, I did get to see a Tomcat for the first time at the air show there, and I didn't get to see one again until the VT-10 days. And again, I've kind of taken after my dad. I've taken a camera with me just about on every flight that I ever had, and I had it with me quite often during those training days. And I got this F-14 came in from the West Coast. It was an aardvark, so it was, I think, a VF-114 with a guy named Bill Nevius was in the RIO seat, and I'm friends with him indirectly on Facebook. But I got pictures of him. He let me climb in the back seat, and I've got pictures of him talking to me and chatting and pointing out things and stuff like that. So yeah, and there was really no question. I was going to at least try for it. My dad was an attack pilot, but he was a pilot. He wasn't an NFO. And at that time, of course, we're talking late 80s or mid 80s. The Tomcat was still the absolute kick-ass plane in the world, not in the U.S., not in the Northern Hemisphere, not in the Eastern Northern Hemisphere. It was in the world. And at that time, 86, Top Gun came out. And so not only did I want to do that, the most popular movie in the world was about my job that was going to be. So all that worked out good. But I did get to hang around there in VT-10. Of course, they're not going to give you a flight. The flights are limited to the T2s and the training command planes, the T-34 first, the T-47, which is the Cessna Citation jet. They fitted it with 3 or 4 radar stations. So that's where we learned our radar skills. And then the final flights were the TA-4s. Had about 10 flights with those. As you gradually get into the more complex, the more constricted cockpit and things like that. So, and then, so I requested F-14s, and we had 25 people. Just another little side story. We had 25 people in our class, and I'm sure the majority of them probably wanted F-14s. But some of the guys did want to go S3. They wanted to go P3s. They wanted to go support aircraft kind of stuff. But then when the selection time came, everybody was kind of wondering what they were going to get. 25 guys. Number 1 in the class always gets his first choice. That was Tom Neely. Number 25 in the class always gets what number 1 asks for. So he is, because if you're always going to get number 1, you're also going to get the worst guy in the class. So that's how they did that. This selection program had 3 slots for Tomcat guys. So number 1 went to Tom Neely. Number 25 went to Mark Kreider. Number 15 or 14, wherever I was, right in the middle, 12, went to me. So I was right smack dab in the middle. So anytime that I say, we have this saying, you're either pack, kind of like the middle of the pack plus, you're in the upper half, or pack minus, you're in the lower half. I say sometimes being pack is good, because I was in the middle of the pack, and I got Tomcats. So the 3 of us got the Tomcat program, and the rest is history, as they say.
Well, I mean, it's phenomenal how it lines up for you. I mean, and I get it. The Tomcat, 1986, Top Gun. It's a hot bird. It was a hot bird to begin with, Top Gun made it hotter just for the American average viewer who didn't know about it. But I want to go back to England for a second, simply because I've been interviewing, like I told you earlier, Greg Magic Quist, who was one of the first F-14 pilots that came on the scene in '75. And I wouldn't say one of the first, but one of the earlier ones. But Greg and I talked about him being on a deployment in the Mediterranean, going up to England, participating in an air show, and then also dogfighting the RAF Lakenheath F-15s.
Yes. Yep.
And so I find that super ironic, once again, how small the naval aviation world is. But hearing Greg, and I'm sure you've got excellent dogfight stories, talk about dogfighting the F-15s is one of the coolest aspects for me, just because I get to show it to my dad. And, dad being with F-15s, it's a good conversation.
Yep. Well, I'd be curious to find out where Magic, when he did that air show up in England, because like I said, it was at Farnborough was the big sort of it's kind of like the Paris Air Show of England was at Farnborough, and again, and I've got photos. I got one right up there that of the Tomcat that they brought to Farnborough. Again in 1975, 76 timeframe, and when I did my med cruise in 88, 89, this was obviously 12, 13 years later. They weren't doing as many of those fly off the ship, go to air show things. Plus, we went from August until February was our 6-month cruise, and so it was it was outside of the air show season, really. So we didn't get to do any of that stuff. Later on, I know that my squadron, VF-14 that I was with, did send airplanes to air shows later, but it was earlier on in the year through the spring and summer when they were having air shows. And you don't want to fly an air show program on cruise. It's not what you practice. It's not in your wheelhouse. It's not something that you're really concerned about. So it was all static display.
Well, and I was going to even bring up the fact too. I mean, with the air shows, I know Greg mentioned that a positive of being able to do that was that it was great flying time hours wise. There are certain circuits, certain hours you need to get in, and hopping up from the Mediterranean, doing a cross country to England. He said that, it was great flying time, and you get to see the countryside. Absolutely beautiful to that. And of course, dogfighting allies or, dogfighting the Air Force guys on the way up, just because who's going to see what happens 50 miles off the coast?
Sure. Yeah. We again, when we went, you got to think about the geopolitical kind of world at that time, 88 to 89. It wasn't even a violent peace. There wasn't much going on at that time in 88 and 89. In fact, the Soviet Union fell apart there in 1990. So they weren't even doing much. And so when we went there, and Kennedy was an oil burner, my ship, it wasn't a nuke. So we could go pier side periodically, and which is nukes are more restricted in terms of going pier side because they've got suction pumps that bring in cooling water and all that kind of stuff. So you don't want to have to run those things and risk them sucking up dirt and mud and all that kind of crap and all that stuff. So Kennedy could pull in. We pulled in, I think, 3 times. But since and again, the 80s, you don't have to worry that much about fuel like you do now. I mean, we've got a full nuclear carrier thing, but they didn't want us to sail that. We had 11 or 12 port calls in that 6 months. So every 2 weeks we would pull in someplace. And but when we got there, we fought French F-8s, the Egyptian F-16s, Moroccan F-5s, and I think the Turkish guys had Mirage aircraft. So we did a lot of fighting. Exercises and stuff like that we were involved in there. So that was good. And we also did a lot of low levels on Sicily and southern France, in Italy and stuff like that. So we did get to see a lot of the countryside, and that was a cool thing. I've got some cool pictures Mount Etna, blowing steam off as we're flying out of Sicily, going back to the carrier. So it's but I know exactly what he's talking about. I never got space to grab gas and then go on to some English place. And I just got a note saying my internet connection is unstable. I hope this recording is going good.
Good. I mean, we're still good on my end.
Okay, good.
Well, I mean, and one of the things I wanted to bring up, maybe not today, but it's going to happen now, obviously. You mentioned the photographs, and I know that you've got a book of your photographs that you took in the RIO seat that you published.
Yep.
And it's pretty well known within the Tomcat community that a lot of the RIOs carried cameras. I mean,
Sure.
you've got a bio who is, of course, pretty famous now for the books that he's published about being a Tomcat RIO. And so being there in the back seat of this jet and taking those photographs, didn't plan on it, but what's it like being able to have some of these photographs still floating around the internet today as some of the most world famous photographs of Tomcats in action? How does that feel knowing you were a part of that?
Well, it's kind of interesting going back to the early or the late 80s and the early 90s. I got a camera. It was a Minolta X370, which was a rather upscale and a good film camera back then. And I got that during the Pensacola days, but you're always balancing taking pictures with doing your job and learning your job. So I don't have hardly any training photos. I've got a couple, but that's about it really. And then when I got to the RAG to VF-101, I hardly ever took my camera up because I was trying to make it through the program. I got a couple downs, and I did have what was called a FENAB, FEANAB, which is Field or FNEA, Field Naval Aviator Evaluation Board, where they do take a look at you and say, well, you got to check and see if you're good for the program. And I made it through that. So that was good. It was just a little drop of the ball as I came. And one of them was down in Key West. So I had to catch a C-130 that was leaving Key West, coming back up north. And it was coming back up north to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, which is down in South, or I think it might have been South Carolina. So the wife had to drive a couple hours down there to pick me up. And when I got back to the RAG squadron, Gus Grissom said, "Oh, so you fell on your sword, huh?" I said, "Yeah, okay, that's a good way of looking at it." But I managed to make it through, and I answered all their questions properly. And again, everything kind of worked out with that. But I get on these tangents and I forget what the question was.
Bill, never apologize. The tangents are great.
Yeah.
Well, it's perfect because it leads me to another question. What was your first landing experience on the carrier in training when you're doing those initial grabs with the tail hook? What was that like?
Yeah, the pilots, of course, always have to go through a carrier qualification program in the RAG. They got to get 5-day and 3-night or something like that, whatever it is. And that has happened a lot in my career. RIOs don't have to do that. Sometimes it's lucky that one of the instructors in the RAG might need a backseater to go out and get requalified if he's going back to the fleet or something like that. And sometimes they would grab a student RIO to stick in a back seat, but generally you wouldn't do that. So as a RIO, your first trap is when you get to your squadron and when they first get ready to go out on the ship for the first time. And I was flying with a guy named Chris Rice. His call sign was Baja. He ran off the end of the runway once, and so that's where the Baja came from. And we were out on Kennedy, and I was still new to the squadron, probably just two or three months or something like that. And so I was really focused. I was talking to everybody. What's it going to be like? What do I have to do? What's the pilot looking for? Blah, 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 and all this stuff. And because pilots look for certain things, and different pilots want different things from the RIO. Some pilots are fixed and they would make ideal single seat because they want to do everything themselves. They don't want anything. Other pilots want the 3 big things, which is altitude, airspeed, angle of attack. three of those things, and he'll keep track of the lineup and all that kind of stuff. But like I would be coming up, and what I would do is I would put a finger on the airspeed indicator, because prior to landing, you always check your pocket checklist to see what the on speed is going to be based on your weight. We pretty much know exactly what the weight's going to be, and that's figured up prior to climbing in the jet. It's usually like 144,000 pounds or something like that. And then you add in the weapons, which could be 2,000 or 3,000 pounds or something like that. And then the amount of fuel that you have. So that's how you come up with, okay, our weight when we're landing is going to be 148,000 pounds. So you go to your checklist, you check your chart that says, okay, 148,000 pounds. We got 20 knots of wind coming up. On speed is going to be 136. So I put my finger on that airspeed indicator, and because when he's coming into land, he wants to be right at 136 miles an hour. And I know it's kind of difficult with parallax and with the avionics equivalents of a fat finger kind of thing, but I would be able to tell him, okay, you're 2 knots fast, you're 2 knots fast, so that he would have a litany going on in the back of his head. And I would say, you're on speed, you're on speed, you're on speed, or something like that. And so that is what they are looking for. So when I was flying this hop with Baja, I was just starting to learn those kinds of things. And what they would do is they would do a trap cat trap. They would shoot you off. You would drop the gear immediately and get in the pattern. Come around, get lined up. You wanted to be 450 knots at the 90-degree angle or something around there, and then 375 later on. And then when you're on final, you kind of forget about that. The pilot or the RIO is going to call the ball, 110 Tomcat ball, and then you say the amount of fuel that you have, so they got an idea just what the situation is. And then he's lining up and he's checking lineup and he's checking angle of attack, and I'm calling out air speeds and stuff like that. And then we come down and hopefully grab a 3-wire. So, and it all worked out fine. You don't know what that deceleration is going to be like. So that's a experience. You sit there and you lock your seat. You've got the inertial reels on your that are hooked to the seat and whatnot, and you lock that so you don't get. After a while, you don't even lock the damn thing because you're just used to it. You're reaching up and there's a handle up on top of the glare shield, right on top of your instrument panel, that you kind of hang on to that, and that kind of breaks your stuff. Although my camera did go flying. When you stop, you go from 135 miles an hour down to 0 in about 200 feet. And if it's not secured, your camera is going to still be going 135 miles an hour for about a half second. And it's going to go from here on the side to hit the glare shield. So you really wanted to make sure that everything was tied down securely.
No kidding. I mean, and with that too in the back seat, I mean, you're calling angle, altitude, you're calling speed as well. Other than that, in the F-14, it's out of your control. You have no other control back there outside of what different altitudes and speeds that you can call. And
I was told a long time ago that it doesn't matter how much experience you have as a RIO or what your rank is or anything like that. You never have more than 49% of control of the jet. 51 is always the starting point for the pilot. So yeah, but again, the Tomcat was a completely and totally designed 2-person aircraft. There was one of the early Grumman pilots was flying an air show at Pax River early in the program, like 72, 71 timeframe. And he was flying without a RIO, and he ended up crashing and killing himself. And after that, I do not remember. I think there are some stories that somebody has flown without a RIO before or since then. I don't know what they are or who they are, but as far as I know, especially from a fleet perspective, it was always a 2-person aircraft. So even though you didn't control any of the aircraft stuff, there was still a lot of stuff for you to do.
Most certainly. And I think that's important to highlight is that it's a multi-crew aircraft, and while sure the pilot flies it, you also play a very important role in the back that can't be forgotten. I mean, and there's a reason that the F-14 is a multi-crew aircraft, and we'll eventually get to that as well. And for one of the last questions here for our interview, I don't want to keep you too long,
Yep.
late East Coast guys. Your call sign Pinch, how did that come about?
Okay, well, I can read it to you. I got the book here. This is the book that I put together with quite a few of the photos and stuff like that. And I've got a little part in here. I'll try and paraphrase it to talk about how I got my call sign. And just a little bit on the call sign. Because in the attack world, when my dad was flying with the A4, with the A6, they don't use call signs that much. In the fighter community, it's important because anybody named Bill or John or Todd or whatever the hell your name might be, you can't use that when you're flying around. You are communicating an awful lot with other aircraft in a dogfight. Break left when I fire, or go this way or go that way, or so-and-so is out of fuel, or on bingo or whatever. So you got to have a call sign in the fighter community. And for a lot of people, sometimes it's simply your last name adjusted. My nickname through part of college and whatnot was Pays, which was part of Paisley. They just shortened it to Pays. So that's kind of like what I got into the Navy with. And that was, we had these T-shirts from Officer Candidate School, and I had Pays back in the back. And then when I got to the squadron, I kind of knew that it wasn't going to last long, because the squadron is where you get them. That's where you're going to do some dumb shit thing, or some crazy thing, or some wild thing, or some outstanding thing that's going to generate a call sign. And like, for instance, we had dancers at the officers club on Wednesday afternoon. Tasha was the dancer in the back bar, and I was, again, new to the squadron, and the squadron would go en masse, and this thing would be 3 or 4 people deep, this dancing area with the dancers. And I'll leave what the dancers did to your imagination. But she came up to, I was in the front row, and she came up to me, and dancing in front, and she takes my glasses off, and she kind of folds them nicely, and then she kind of puts them down in her area here, and then pulls them back out and stuck them back on me like that. And one of the pilots I was flying with, Mark Marcioni, his call sign was Cherry, said, he was clapping. He was saying, there's got to be a call sign in here somewhere. So that's kind of like the kind of things that happen where you get a call sign. But I didn't get it from that. Pinch came from, in the hangar, they got a little snack bar down at the bottom of the hangar. And I went in there one morning to get something to eat, a donut or something. And the donut was like 95 cents. I'm kind of approximating here, but it was 95 cents. And all I had was $1. So I gave the guy $1. He didn't have the till open yet. So I said, that's okay. You owe me 5 cents. So I took my donut and went away. I went back down there during lunch to get a sandwich. And just for sake of numbers and stuff, the sandwich was $1.05 now. So, and I had another $1, but I didn't have the 5 cents. I gave him the $1 and said, that's okay. You owe me 5 cents from this morning. Well, there was another guy from the squadron in line back behind me, Mark Rognes. His call sign was Rogie. He got back to the ready room first. And the way that he was telling the story, because this guy wouldn't give me my 5 cents, I had grabbed him, pulled him over the countertop. I was beating the shit out of him, all because he after that, it was kind of funny. We all had mailboxes in the back of the ready room that orders or mail or whatever would get tossed into. People would throw pennies I would at any one time have a dozen pennies or so in my mailbox because people would always give me money because pinching pennies and pinch Paisley and all that kind of stuff. He can't afford 5 cents kind of stuff. So that worked out pretty good. I kind of like that one. That's it. As somebody said, it could be worse.
It indeed could be worse, and I know that you've indeed
yeah.
heard worse. And
Yeah.
I won't keep you any longer for this first one, Bill. This has been phenomenal. And if you want me to, I know Magic wants me to call him Magic. Whatever you prefer, I'm all ears. But I want to say thank you for your service.
Whatever.
I can work with that pinch. And I always,
Yeah.
go ahead, sir.
Thank you.
I mean,
Appreciate it, Zach.
I'm just a history teacher with
I'm in my little, office here, and I got my up on top. I can't. I got my two helmets. My Tophatter helmet. This helmet is my Grumman helmet that they gave me, which was form fitted. We had to put a big thing on our head, and they poured form fitting foam in it, and it solidified and all that stuff. There's a really nice F-14 model that a buddy of mine built there. That came from Dorian Dogaroo and flagged from someplace. So I a lot of, and my dad's got an A4 that a buddy of mine made. So we're kind of like a big Navy family here, and it was a good career. I'm 65 now, so all that stuff. I'm probably not going to fly like that again. I was really lucky. I was with a East Coast Air Show flight team that flew a L-39. So, which had active ejection seats and can pull 6Gs. So I found out pulling 6Gs when you're in your late 50s is a lot different than pulling 6Gs when you're in your late 20s. It was tough, but I did it.
I'm sure it was. I mean, and I think this is going to be a good start to a series of interviews about RIO and your career within the Navy. And I'm excited for it, Pinch. I really am. This is going to be awesome.
Well, good. Whatever I can do for you, Zach. Not a
Thank
problem.
you, sir. I truly appreciate that. And then I will be in touch. We'll pick this up sometime next week when I don't have to coach soccer or go to soccer games, and we'll go from there, sir.
Would love to. Good to meet you, and you take care, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate this.
All right. See you later. Bye-bye.